The sound of motorcycles ripped through the quiet of our neighborhood like a storm rolling in. My wife stood frozen at the window, her hands trembling as leather-jacketed bikers circled our driveway. Their engines roared, their boots slammed against the pavement, and their tattoos screamed intimidation. She knew the HOA had been pushing us, but no one imagined they'd go this far, sending a pack of biker thugs to scare her while I was inside. What they didn't know was that my past wasn't something you could measure in HOA fines and warning letters. I wasn't just some homeowner they could push around. 3 minutes after they pulled up, the same men who had come to terrify us were standing at my door with pale faces, their voices shaking, begging me to stop what I had already started. They thought they knew fair until they met me. The first time the HOA sent a letter, I laughed. It was printed neatly, tucked into an envelope with my name written in stiff handwriting, and it looked harmless enough. My wife Jenna found it taped to our front door on a Sunday morning. She brought it in, frowning, and laid it on the kitchen table while I poured my coffee. "Read this," she said, sliding it across the table. Toward me, the letter complained about my truck, my old Ford pickup that I kept parked in our driveway. According to the HOA, it was unsightly and non-compliant with the community image. They wanted it gone, not moved, not covered, gone. The note ended with a friendly reminder that fines would begin if we didn't comply. I sipped my coffee, chuckling. They must be joking. This truck's been with me longer than half. These people have lived here. But Jenna didn't laugh. She looked worried. She always hated conflict, and she knew I wasn't the kind of man who gave in. "What if they mean it?" she asked quietly. "They can mean it all they want," I said, folding the letter and tossing it into the drawer. "I'm not getting rid of something that belongs to me because some committee doesn't like how it looks." That should have been the end of it. But the letters kept coming. First about the truck, then about the flagpole I had planted in the yard. The HOA said it was too tall. After that, it was Jenna's roses, so apparently they weren't the approved landscaping design. I could see how it wore her down. Each note, another reminder that someone was watching, judging, waiting for us to slip up. I told her not to worry, that they couldn't touch us if we stood our ground. But truthfully, I felt the heat too. There's something unnerving about knowing a group of strangers has the power to decide how you live in your own home. The real turning point came one evening when Jenna was out front watering her flowers. A woman I recognized from the HOA board, Corinne, her name, was stopped by with her little clipboard tucked under her arm. She didn't greet Jenna, didn't smile, just pointed at the roses. "These need to be removed," she said flatly. Jenna looked at her in disbelief. "They're just roses. They're not hurting anyone. They don't match the community guidelines," Karen snapped. "We'll be issuing a violation notice." When I stepped outside, wiping the sweat from my brow after tinkering in the garage, Karen's eyes flicked to me, and for the first time, she hesitated. I'm not a small man. Years of service, years of training, years of carrying myself in places where hesitation meant death at all shows. I didn't say a word, just stood beside Jenna with my arms crossed. Karen mumbled something about rules, our rules, before hurrying down the sidewalk. That night, Jenna curled against me, whispering that she felt like we were being hunted in our own neighborhood. "It's not just the letters anymore," she said. "It's the way they look at us, like we don't belong here." I stroked her hair and told her it would be fine, but deep inside I knew the HOA wasn't letting this go. They had singled us out, and they were building pressure, waiting for us to snap. And then came the evening when the rumble of motorcycles shattered the peace. It was a Tuesday, around dusk. I had just settled into my chair with a beer, the sun dipping low behind the rooftops, when Jenna froze by the window. Her eyes widened, her hand clutching the curtain as the sound grew louder. Deep, thunderous engines rolling down our quiet suburban street. "What is that?" she whispered. I stood and walked over, and what I saw made my jaw tighten. 6 motorcycles, big and black, rumbled into the neighborhood like a storm cloud. The riders wore leather vests, patches sewn across their backs, their faces shadowed under helmets. They slowed when they reached our driveway, circling like wolves sizing up their prey. One of them revved his engine so loud it shook the glass. Another kicked his boot against the pavement, the sound sharp and deliberate. Jenna stepped back, trembling. "What do they want?" I didn't answer right away. My instincts told me this wasn't random. These men weren't out for a joyride. They were here for a reason, and given the timing, I could guess exactly who had set them on us. The HOA wanted to send a message, and they thought a pack of bikers would do the trick. Jenna's voice broke. "They're trying to scare us." She was right. That's all this was, intimidation. But what the HOA didn't know, what those bikers couldn't have guessed, was that fear was a language I had lived in for years. I'd faced men with bombs strapped to their chests, ambushes in deserts where every grain of sand could hide an enemy, nights so dark I couldn't see the man next to me until he bled out in my arms. You don't send 6 bikers to scare someone who has already walked through hell. I placed a steady hand on Jenna's shoulder. "Stay inside," I told her, her eyes filled with panic. "Don't go out there. I have to." I stepped out onto the porch, the air thick with gasoline and arrogance. The bikers slowed, engines still growling, and the leader dismounted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his arms covered in tattoos that crawled up his neck. He yanked off his helmet, revealing a smirk carved into his face like he'd been practicing it for years. "This your house?" he asked, his voice loud, meant to carry. I didn't answer. I just looked at him, calm, steady, the way I always had when I wanted to measure a man's soul. He spat on the gravel. "Pretty place. Be a shame if something happened to it." His men chuckled behind him, tapping their boots, swinging chains, making noise for the sake of fear. Jenna was watching from inside. I could feel her eyes on me, her fear trembling through the glass. I didn't move, didn't flinch. My silence unsettled them more than any words could. The leader's smirk faltered just slightly. He shifted his weight, glancing at his men as if to make sure they were still behind him. I kept staring, my arms crossed, my posture relaxed but unyielding. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't an act. It was the same stance I had taken 100 times before, facing men who thought they had the upper hand until they realized they were already outmatched. The laughter behind him died down. The men stopped swinging their chains. The leader's smirk twisted into something tighter, forced, like he couldn't quite hold on to it anymore. He cleared his throat, spat again, and said, "We just came to talk." Still, I said nothing. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until even Jenna could feel it from inside. The bikers shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, waiting for their leader to do something. But there was nothing he could do, because fear, real fear, isn't loud. It doesn't roar or swing chains. It seeps in quietly, like cold water, until you realize you can't breathe. 3 minutes later, the same man who had stepped off his bike with swagger walked toward me with a different expression altogether. His voice, once loud and mocking, was low now, uncertain. "Hey, maybe we got off on the wrong foot." I let him squirm in that silence. Let him feel the weight of every bad decision that had brought him to my driveway. Behind him, the others had already softened, their shoulders slumped, their eyes flicking nervously, their engines rumbling like restless animals ready to bolt. They weren't laughing anymore. They weren't mocking. They were waiting for a chance to leave. Jenna's fear melted into something else. She watched as the men who had come to scare her now looked at me like cornered prey. The same lips that had promised menace were now begging me to stop, begging me not to push further, and I hadn't even said a word. That was the first night I realized just how far the HOA was willing to go. They hadn't counted on me. They thought they were dealing with another family they could bully into compliance. But they had no idea what kind of man lived in this house. And now, neither did those bikers. The bikers left that night slower than they had arrived, their engines rumbling off into the distance, their shoulders heavy with the weight of something they hadn't expected. Jenna stood in the doorway long after they were gone, her hand clutching the frame as if she still wasn't sure it was safe to breathe. I closed the door gently behind me and locked it. Though I knew locks had never been the real measure of safety, she turned to me, her eyes wide, searching. "What just happened?" I shrugged, calm as ever. "They came to scare us, but they scared themselves instead." "That's not normal," she whispered, shaking her head. "People don't just back down like that. Not men like them." I didn't answer. I couldn't tell her the truth, not all of it. She knew bits and pieces of my past, but I had never painted her the full picture. I had seen men far harder than those bikers fold under pressure they didn't understand. Fear isn't about size or sound. It's about reading a man's eyes and showing him something he isn't ready to face. I had learned that overseas, in deserts and cities where every street corner could mean the end, but I wasn't about to put those ghosts on her shoulders. "They won't be back," I said instead, squeezing her hand. "Not after tonight." For a few days, peace returned. The roses bloomed. My truck sat proudly in the driveway, and we tried to slip back into normal life. Jenna began smiling again, though I caught her glancing at the street now and then, half expecting the roar of engines. I told her to relax, and she tried, but deep down I knew the HOA wouldn't stop here. People like them don't know when to quit. They had been embarrassed, and that kind of humiliation doesn't sit quietly. I was right. It was the following Saturday when I saw Karen again. She was standing across the street, speaking to a neighbor with her clipboard tucked under her arm. When her eyes met mine, she stiffened. There was a flicker of something in her stare, not fear, but calculation. She turned away quickly, but not before I caught it. That's when I knew she hadn't given up. She was planning her next move. Later that day, I found a fresh letter in the mailbox. Unlike the others, this one was typed in bold font, the language sharp and clipped. It accused us of being a threat to community harmony and warned that further violations will result in escalated action. I showed it to Jenna, and she paled. "They're coming after us harder," she said, her voice tight. "What do we do?" I folded the letter and tucked it into the same drawer where the others lay, a neat little pile of nonsense. "We do what we've always done," I told her. "We live our lives. They don't own us." But I could feel the shift. This wasn't about a truck or flowers anymore. It wasn't even about rules. It was about power. The HOA had tested their muscle, sent men to rattle us, and when that failed, they decided to escalate. People like them hate losing, and they hated me now, because I didn't play by their rules. That night, I sat on the porch long after Jenna went to bed. The air was cool, the street empty, and I thought about the choices that had led me here. I had wanted a quiet life after the service. A small house, a good woman, some peace to settle my bones. But peace is a fragile thing, and people like Karen treat it like glass in their hands. I had seen empires collapse, villages torn apart by petty power games, and here I was, watching the same thing unfold on a smaller scale, right in front of my home. The next morning, Jenna woke me early. "You need to see this," she said, pulling me toward the front door. Spray painted across our garage in thick black letters were the words, "Move out." Jenna's hands trembled as she covered her mouth. Oh my God. I felt a slow burn rise in my chest. Not fear, but anger. The bikers had been meant to scare us, but this was different. This was personal. Someone had come in the night, crossed onto my property, stood on my land, and defended my home. That wasn't just intimidation, that was war. Neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, whispering but not stepping forward. Cowards, every one of them. They knew what had happened, but none would say a word against the HOA. That's how bullies survive. By convincing the crowd that silence is safer than resistance. Jenna was nearly in tears. "We can't live like this. What if they come back? What if they hurt you or me?" I took her hands firmly. "They won't hurt you, not while I'm here." But even as I said it, I knew the HOA had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. They thought they were breaking me down, but all they were doing was waking up the part of me I had tried to bury. That afternoon, I went into town. Not for weapons, I didn't need those. What I needed was information. I walked into a local bar I hadn't set foot in since moving here. The kind of place where the wood was scarred, the air smelled of smoke, and men who knew things nursed their drinks in dark corners. I ordered a beer and sat listening. It didn't take long. A pair of men at the bar were talking about Karen and her board with mocking tones. One of them laughed, saying she actually thinks she's a general running an army. The other shook his head. She pays off the wrong people, too. Those bikers, they don't even belong here. Outsiders. Hired muscle. Bingo. I finished my beer and left without a word. That was all I needed to confirm what I already suspected. The HOA wasn't just playing neighborhood politics anymore. They were reaching out to darker corners, bringing in people from outside to do their dirty work. That meant money was flowing. And where there's money, there's a trail. When I got home, Jenna was waiting on the porch, still shaken by the graffiti. "Did you find anything?" she asked. "Enough," I told her. "They're not stopping, but neither am I." She searched my face, fear and trust warring in her eyes. "Promise me you won't let this get out of control." I kissed her forehead, but I couldn't make that promise, because it was already out of control. That night, as I sat awake with the house dark and silent around me, I thought back to the bikers' faces, the way their arrogance had crumbled in 3 minutes flat. That same fear could work on the HOA too. They thought they had power, but power is only real when people believe in it. Break that belief, and the whole structure collapses. The HOA wanted a war. They had no idea who they were up against. The morning after the graffiti, the sun rose sharp and blinding, but our garage door still carried its ugly message like a scar. I stood outside with a bucket of paint, brushing over the words slowly, while Jenna sat on the porch steps, hugging her knees. Neighbors passed by in their cars, some slowing down, some not daring to look. Nobody stopped to help. Nobody said a word. That silence was louder than any engine, and it told me what I already knew: people would rather live with a bully than stand up to one. Jenna finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like they're closing in on us." I dipped the brush again, steady and calm. Then we pushed back. Her eyes searched mine. "You mean fight them?" I didn't answer right away. Fighting isn't always fists or weapons, it's knowing where to hit so hard that the other side doesn't get up again. I had no interest in brawling with hired bikers in the street, but if the HOA wanted to play games with power, I knew a few of my own. That night, when the house was quiet and Jenna finally slept, I pulled out an old box from the back of the closet. Inside were pieces of a life I had tried to leave behind: documents, contacts, memories too heavy for daylight. I thumbed through them slowly, the smell of paper and dust mixing with the old ache in my chest. Most of it I would never use again, but there were numbers in their names of men who owed me favors, men who could dig up information better than any detective. I called one of them. His voice on the other end was rough, seasoned by years of secrets. "Haven't heard from you in a long time," he said. "Didn't think I'd ever need to call," I admitted, "but I've got a problem." "Local? A homeowners association that doesn't know when to stop." He chuckled low. "You're kidding me. After everything you've been through, it's an HOA that drags you back to me." "Don't laugh," I said, though part of me wanted to. "They're not just sending letters, they've hired muscle outsiders, and I need to know who's paying them, how much, and where it's coming from." He went quiet for a moment. "Then, give me names. I'll see what I can dig up." I gave him Karen's name, along with 2 others I'd seen hanging around the board meetings. When I hung up, I felt lighter, though I knew this wasn't going to be pretty. The next few days were quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet you get before a storm breaks. Jenna began to relax again, even smiling as she tended her roses. I didn't tell her about the call. No reason to worry her until I had answers. By Thursday, my contact called back. "You've got a nasty little operation over there," he said. Your HOA president's been dipping into community funds slush accounts, fake maintenance fees, the works, and she's funneling cash to a biker gang out of state. Real thugs, not the kind who play fair. I clenched the phone tighter. She's using homeowners' money to pay criminals. Exactly. And here's the kicker there, laundering it through shell companies. On paper, it looks like landscaping contracts and security fees. In reality, she's buying muscle. I paced the kitchen as he talked, anger rising like a tide. It wasn't just about me and Jenna anymore. Every family in this neighborhood was being robbed blind, paying dues that were lining the pockets of crooks. And nobody knew, because they were too busy being afraid. What do you want to do with this info? My contact asked. I stared out the window at the quiet street. The trimmed lawns? The perfect little world, Karen thought, she controlled. I want to make sure she never has power again. That night, I told Jenna everything. At first she looked horrified. She's stealing from everyone and paying bikers to come here. I nodded. That's why they backed down the other night. They weren't here on principle. They were here on payroll. And payroll can be cut. Her voice shook. But what if she finds out, you know? What if she tries something worse? I took her hands in mine. Then she regretted. But I'm not waiting for her next move. It's our turn now. The plan began slowly. I attended the next HOA meeting, something I hadn't bothered with since we moved in. The room was full of folding chairs, cheap coffee, and the same tired faces who signed off on whatever Karen put in front of them. She sat at the front like a queen on her throne, clipboard ready, glasses perched on her nose. When I walked in, her smile faltered just slightly. "Nice of you to join us," she said. I gave her a polite nod and sat in the back. For most of the meeting, I listened quietly. They droned on about lawn standards, trash can placement, and pool hours nonsense designed to keep people distracted. But when the floor opened for questions, I stood. "I have one," I said. "Could the board explain why thousands of dollars in HOA fees have been routed through shell companies tied to biker gangs out of state?" The room went dead silent. Karen's face drained of color. A man on her left dropped his pen. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said quickly. I pulled a paper from my pocket, one of the documents my contact had sent me. "Then maybe you can explain this. A landscaping contract for services that were never performed. Signed by you? The money ended up in the account of a biker gang president. Would you like me to keep reading?" Gasps rippled through the room. People who had been silent for months suddenly sat straighter, their eyes wide. For the first time, Karen wasn't in control. "This is slander," she snapped, but her voice shook. "You have no proof." "Oh, I have plenty," I said evenly. "And if you'd like, I can take it straight to the county prosecutor. Or the FBI, they love this kind of thing." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She knew she was cornered, and worse, everyone else knew it too. The meeting broke down into chaos after that. Neighbors shouted, demanded answers, waved their hands angrily. Karen tried to gavel it down, but nobody listened. I left before it turned into a riot, satisfied that the seed had been planted. Back home, Jenna met me at the door. "How did it go?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Better than I expected. The cracks are showing. It's only a matter of time before she breaks." But Karen wasn't the type to surrender quietly, and I knew it. When you strip power away from someone who built their life on it, they don't just walk away, they lash out. The only question was how far she was willing to go. 2 nights later, I had my answer. It was past midnight when I heard the low rumble of vengeance again. Not 6 this time, more like 10. The sound rolled through the neighborhood like thunder, waking lights in houses up and down the street. Jenna sat up in bed, her eyes wide with fear. "They're back," she whispered. I slipped out of bed, calm as ever, and pulled on my boots. "Stay here," I told her. I stepped onto the porch as the motorcycles lined up in front of my house, their headlights flooding the driveway. The same leader from before was there, his face hard, his jaw tight, but this time, there was no smirk. He dismounted, walked up a few steps, and stopped short when I didn't move. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, to my surprise, he lowered his voice and said, "We don't want trouble with you. We didn't know who you were before, but she's paying us too much to walk away." He glanced back at his men, then at me again. His eyes weren't mocking this time, they were cautious, careful. He knew he was standing on dangerous ground, and in that moment, I realized something. The bikers weren't the real enemy. They were pawns. The enemy was Karen, and if I wanted this war to end, I had to cut the head off the snake. I leaned forward just slightly, enough for him to see I meant every word. "Tell her this ends now, or the next time. You won't be standing here talking." His Adam's apple bobbed. He nodded once, sharp and quick. Then he turned, mounted his bike, and within seconds the engines roared away into the night. I stood there a long time, the cool air biting my skin, until the last sound faded. Jenna opened the door slowly, her face pale. "What did you say to them?" "Enough," I told her. Now it's her turn to be afraid. The night the bikers left my driveway for the second time, the air felt different. It wasn't the cool breeze or the stillness of the neighborhood. It was something heavier. The balance of power had shifted. For the first time since the 8 had started its war, I felt like Karen was the one on edge. She had thrown everything at us, letters, threats, even hired muscle, and all of it had crumbled. That kind of failure eats at people like her. I knew she wouldn't sleep that night. I knew she'd be sitting at her desk, plotting her next desperate move. Inside, Jenna couldn't stop pacing. "This isn't over," she whispered, running her hands through her hair. "You saw them 10 motorcycles this time. They'll keep coming until one of us gets hurt." I took her hands gently and made her sit. "Listen to me. They didn't come here to fight tonight. They came to warn me. That means they're already doubting her. She's losing control of her own people. But what if she doesn't stop?" Jenna's eyes searched mine. "What if she decides to go further?" I leaned back in my chair, calm but firm. "Then I'll make sure she never has the chance." For the next few days, things in the neighborhood began to shift. It was subtle at first. The way people glanced at Karen when she walked by, the whispers outside during trash collection, the nervous chatter at the community park. News spreads fast in small places, and the fallout from the meeting where I confronted her was finally seeping through the cracks. People were asking questions Karen couldn't silence with a clipboard and a rulebook. On Wednesday evening, I got another call from my contact. His voice carried that same low rasp, but this time there was a grin behind it. "Your HOA president is in deep," he said. "She's panicking. Tried moving some of the money to an offshore account, but she's sloppy. We've got enough to sink her 3 times over." "Good," I said. "Now let's make sure the whole neighborhood sees it." The plan was simple. Expose her lies where everyone could see. I wasn't interested in private confrontations anymore. Karen had turned this into a public war, and it was time for the community to realize the truth. I spent hours combing through documents, highlighting trails of money, fake contracts, payments to men who had never trimmed a single bush or laid a single brick. It wasn't just corruption, it was theft, and every neighbor had been her victim. Jenna sat across from me at the dining table, watching as I laid out the papers. "This is going to ruin her," she said softly. "That's the point," I replied. "But what if she doesn't go quietly?" "She won't," I said, stacking the papers. "That's why we're not giving her a choice." The next HOA meeting was more packed than I had ever seen. Word had spread, and people who usually stayed home showed up, angry and demanding answers. When I walked in with a folder under my arm, the room went silent. Karen was already seated at the front, her face tight, her knuckles white as she gripped her papers. She avoided my eyes, but I could see the tension in her jaw. The meeting began like usual, with her reciting rules and updates in her clipped tone. But the crowd wasn't listening, they were waiting. I let her finish before I stood. "I'd like to share something," I said, my voice carrying across the room. Karen froze. "You've already made enough baseless accusations," she snapped, opened the folder, and began laying out papers on the table in front of the crowd. "These aren't accusations. These are records. HOA funds funneled through fake companies. Payments to a biker gang that showed up in our neighborhood. Contracts signed by your hand for services that were never performed. Would you like me to keep going?" The room erupted. People gasped, shouted, demanded explanations. Karen's face went pale, then red, then pale again. She tried to speak, but the noise drowned her out. "This is slander," she screamed finally, slamming her fist on the table. "No," I said calmly, holding up a document. "This is fraud. And if you don't believe me, the prosecutor's office will, because I've already sent them copies." The room went silent again, this time not from fear, but from shock. Neighbors stared at her, mouths open, the betrayal settling in. She looked around wildly, searching for support, but there was none. Even the board members beside her shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to meet her eyes. For the first time, Karen looked small. The meeting ended in chaos, with people storming out, shouting about lawsuits and refunds. Karen stayed frozen in her chair, her authority crumbling around her like ash. I didn't stick around to watch her unravel. I had made my point. When I got home, Jenna hugged me tightly. "It's over," she said, relief washing over her. I knew better. People like Karen don't just vanish when cornered. They lash out, desperate to cling to whatever scraps of power they have left. And sure enough, that night, as I sat on the porch with the cool air brushing against my skin, I heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles. But this time, they didn't stop in front of my house. They rolled past slowly, their engines lower, less menacing. The leader nodded at me as he passed, almost like a salute. Jenna stepped out beside me. "What was that?" I watched them disappear into the distance. That was a message. They're done with her, and I was right. The very next morning, word spread that Karen's biker friends had turned on her. She had tried to pay them off again, but they'd gotten wind of the heat from law enforcement. The gang wanted no part of an HOA scandal that could bring federal eyes down on them. They cut ties, leaving her without her hired muscle. Jenna could hardly believe it. "She's all alone now." "Exactly," I said. "And people like her can't survive without others to hide behind." Sure enough, within a week, Karen disappeared from the neighborhood. Some said she skipped town, others whispered about federal investigators showing up at her door. Whatever the truth, the HOA was leaderless, its board fractured, its residents furious. For the first time in months, Jenna and I felt peace again. She tended her roses without glancing over her shoulder. I parked my truck proudly in the driveway, the sun glinting off its hood. Neighbors began nodding at me, some even stopping to thank me quietly, though I didn't need their gratitude. Hadn't fought this battle for thanks. I had fought it because no one bullies my wife. And though Karen was gone, I knew this wasn't truly the end. Because power doesn't just vanish, it waits. And when it rises again, I'll be ready. The night air was still heavy with the rumble of motorcycles that had fled minutes earlier. Jenna and I stood at the threshold of our home, the scent of exhaust lingering as if the fear they carried had left a trace behind. She gripped my hand, tightly, her knuckles pale, her eyes still darting to the street, as though the bikers might suddenly reappear. But they wouldn't. Not tonight. Not ever again. The balance had shifted, and even though the HOA thought they could control our lives with intimidation, the game had ended before it ever truly began. I closed the door gently, locking it with a calmness that surprised even me. My wife's trembling slowed as I pulled her close, resting her head against my chest. I could feel her heartbeat finally beginning to steady, the storm inside her slowly fading. "It's over," I whispered. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes, half relief, half disbelief. "They were begging, James," she said softly. "Those men, they came here to hurt us, and they ended up begging." That image burned in my mind as much as it did hers. The so-called tough men who strutted into our driveway with leather and steel, who thought they could use fear as a weapon reduced to shaking voices and desperate pleas. I hadn't laid a hand on them, hadn't raised a bat or even shouted. All it had taken was presence. A reminder that there are some lines you don't cross without consequences. But I knew it wasn't over, not truly. Because behind those men was the real enemy, the HOA board that had sent them here in the first place. And they would try again. I was certain of it. The next morning, Jenna woke earlier than usual. I found her in the kitchen making coffee, her movements brisk and purposeful, almost as though she wanted to reclaim the normalcy the HOA had tried to steal. She smiled faintly when she saw me, though her eyes carried a weight I hadn't seen before. "We can't let them win, James," she said as she handed me a mug. "If we stay silent, they'll think we're afraid, and they'll keep trying until they break us." I nodded. She was right. Fear doesn't vanish overnight. It lingers, and if you don't confront it, it festers. I had faced enemies overseas, who believed the same thing, that fear was a weapon they could sharpen. But I had learned long ago that fear only holds power if you let it. And I was done letting them hold anything over us. Later that afternoon, I walked to the HOA office, a small building tucked neatly between rows of carefully manicured lawns. The sight of me stepping inside made the receptionist stiffen. She knew. Everyone on the board probably already knew what had happened the night before. Word travels fast when men who pretend to be wolves return to their pack with their tails between their legs. The board president, a sharp-eyed woman named Linda, tried to greet me with her usual air of superiority. But I noticed the slight shake in her hand as she adjusted her glasses. She knew why I was there. She also knew that the bikers had failed her. "Mr. Hayes," she said in that clipped, condescending tone she always used. "What a surprise." "Not a surprise," I replied, leaning across the table just enough to make her flinch. "A warning. Don't ever send men to my home again. Don't ever harass my wife again. Whatever your problem is with me, you bring it here, to me. Not to her, not to my doorstep. Not with thugs." Her lips tightened into a thin line, but I saw the flicker of fear in her eyes. She tried to gather herself, adjusting the stack of papers in front of her. "You're overreacting," she said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "We had nothing to do with Don't Lie to Me." I cut her off, my voice low but firm. "Those men wouldn't know my address unless someone handed it to them, and I know it was you." The silence that followed was thick, the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. Instead, she straightened her back and muttered something about rules and regulations. But I was already walking out the door. I didn't need her to admit it. Her fear was proof enough. That night, Jenna and I sat on the porch, the quiet finally returning to the neighborhood. For the first time in weeks, she seemed at peace. The roses she had planted swayed gently in the breeze, and the house finally felt like home again. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "You know," she said softly, "they underestimated you. They thought they could break us. Instead, you broke them." I didn't answer right away. My eyes wandered to the horizon, where the last traces of sunlight melted into night. She was right. They had underestimated me. They thought I was just another homeowner they could bully, another man who would cower in silence while they played their games. But they had forgotten something. My life had been built on standing firm, on protecting what mattered most. As the days turned into weeks, the HOA grew quiet. No more warning letters, no more knocks at the door, no more intimidation. It was as if they had finally learned that some people aren't worth pushing. The bikers never came back, and I doubted they ever would. Fear has a way of teaching lessons that words can't. One evening, Jenna leaned against me as we watched the stars come out. "You know," she whispered, "I think they're done with us. I think they finally understand." I kissed the top of her head and smiled. "Good," I said, "because if they don't, they'll learn again." And with that, the chapter closed. The HOA's power had broken. the bikers' bravado shattered, and for the first time in months, peace truly belonged to us. The house stood tall, the roses bloomed bright, and the silence wasn't one of fear, but of victory. They had sent biker thugs to scare my wife. 3 minutes later, those same men had stood at my door, begging me to stop. And that was the moment the HOA realized they had lost. If you enjoyed this powerful story, don't miss more like it. For more dramatic real-life inspired stories, like, share, comment, and subscribe to my channel, Bright Reality.